Hi. Having buried Abraham in the cave of Couples and Ishmael somewhere else on the way toward Egypt, we turn finally to the Jacob story, and starting in Genesis 25:19, as you can see on the left side of the screen. And in this introductory video, I just want to begin to look at some of the issues we're going to need to consider as we go through these 11 exciting and sometimes confusing and humorous chapters in the story between the parents, Isaac and Rebekah, in the beginning, and then between the brothers, Jacob and Esau, and then with the father-in-law, Laban and Jacob, before it returns back to Esau near the end. And so we're going to do a few things we've been doing as we looked at the beginning of the Abraham and Sarah cycle as well, and ask, first of all, what is the relationship between these chapters in Genesis and the earlier ones? And I'm not going to try to answer some of these questions here. I'm just going to present the range of possibilities as scholars engage and why those are issues, and we'll explore more of the evidence one way or another as we go. We're going to have to keep our minds open a little bit as we try to resolve some of these questions based on the evidence that we see. So as I walk through it and you walk through it with me in these next videos, we'll try to see if we can put some flesh on the bones of the skeleton here on the right side of the screen. So two issues about the relationship. The first one, as you can see here, is the author of the Jacob story the same or different, or is it singular or plural, from the primeval history in Genesis 1 to 11 and the Abraham-Sarah cycle that we just completed in chapter 12 through the beginning of chapter 25. Traditionally, as you've been following my videos, or if you have some familiarity with the history of biblical scholarship, Genesis was understood, like the rest of the Torah, the books from Genesis through Deuteronomy, to be a function of the so-called four-source theory, J-E-D-N-P, which posited a range of sources over time. But there's no need even to lay out what that theory was starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, because virtually all serious scholars have either completely abandoned that theory or left only tiny pieces of it left. And so the idea that we could go through the chapters of Genesis and separate out the J for the so-called Yahwist, or the E for the Elohist, or the P for the priestly author, in continuity with the rest of Genesis and in continuity with Exodus and Leviticus, etc., is not really sufficient to help us understand. And similarly, as you can see in my second question, one or multiple authors / perspectives within the story itself. In other words, is the Jacob story consistent within itself, or does it have multiple viewpoints about the relationship of Jacob to God, or Jacob to the land, or Jacob to his brother, or Jacob to the people of Laban? And is that similar or different than what we saw about Abraham and Sarah, or the characters in the primeval history? That's obviously very complicated, and scholars have spent a lot of time on it. I'm not going to get into that kind of depth here, but it's important that as we look to see, is the perspective we're seeing here consistent, or is it trying to say something different? And that's going to depend upon the next question, the time, place of composition and editing. And so there are several possibilities that scholars look at. And notice this is not positing one particular source that we can name, like a Yahwist or an Elohist, in a particular time, and another one somewhere else. Scholars have pretty much abandoned the idea of putting names on these, but just trying to situate them at least as much as possible within a certain time and place. So the 8th century BCE, which would be a time when Israel, the northern kingdom of the two kingdoms here of Israel and Judah, was struggling with Edom, represented as Esau in this story, or the nation of Aram, represented by Laban. And plainly the text will tell us several times flatly, Esau is Edom. So there's no question about that. They are equated. And as we'll see, and you can even see on the left side of the screen right now in verse 23, right at the very beginning, Yahweh says to Rebekah, as she's struggling with her pregnancy, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. So plainly the story must be read at both the personal level and the political level. But what political level are we reading at about nations that don't exist yet in the time of the story, but are prophetically projected to exist at some point later in the time of the audience or before the time of the audience? And we'll have to look at that point in another minute on another one of my charts. So that's the possibility, and Marvin Sweeney has done a lot around that question, suggesting that Esau is a stand-in for Edom and Laban for Aram. But another perspective is that this comes from the 6th century BCE Babylonian context. In that case, Laban doesn't represent Aram. Laban represents the Mesopotamian perspective of the old country. And there's a number of pieces of evidence for that, the most obvious being that the name Laban, at least in Hebrew, means white, and white represented the full moon in Babylonian culture as the moon god Sin, S-I-N in English, but obviously not related to the theological concept of sin. And there are other elements in the story that suggest a Babylonian context. So it's possible that it's in the Babylonian context. More recently, scholars have suggested, like some of the rest of Genesis, especially people like Mark Brett, that it's a function of the post-exilic period when Jerusalem was rebuilt under Persian sponsorship of what they called Yehud, that this is expressing a, quote, Israelite expression of the relationship between Jerusalem and foreign empires. Well, that's literally Israelite in the sense of the people who lived in the north and were not part of the Jerusalem-Judah monarchy, or people who have been part of the Jerusalem monarchy, but now after exile are questioning the monarchy. And scholars have tended to dichotomize as if somebody, as a writer who would be against the Jerusalem hegemony, must be from somewhere other than Jerusalem. But certainly in the United States where I live, people can be in Washington, D.C. and be pro-government or anti-government, as we certainly see in Congress, where many of the people in Congress who are supposedly lawmakers are against passing laws and against spending government money. So plainly, one can be within an institutional setting or a geographic setting where a dominant view is held and disagree and have a minority view. So a 5th century perspective of the Jacob story does not necessarily tell us where it was from, although it certainly seems consistent with what scholars see as the Israelite perspective, not based on the story we've seen so far, but based on the story we see in the book of Kings, which will follow up in my Samuel series. And we're going to see how the Jacob story is very closely connected with the David story in many ways. Which leads to our next issue, which is a relationship between the Jacob story and other parts of the Bible outside Genesis. Plainly, the Exodus story begins with Jacob's sons arriving in Egypt, and then they dying and Pharaoh dying and another generation coming along, where a Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph or Jacob, and they become slaves. And one of the questions is that just a transitional link to stitch together the end of the Genesis story with the Joseph story, which certainly by my estimation, and I think by most scholars' estimation, is even later than the Jacob story by any of these measures, ostensibly from a Hellenistic era after Alexander the Great in the 3rd century BCE or later, when there was a huge Jewish population in Egypt, and the question of Egypt in particular would have been at issue. But Exodus, I argue, is much older, is simultaneous roughly with the story of the transition of the monarchy from Solomon to his son Rehoboam, and the rebellion that takes place in the north under Jeroboam, and that Exodus is meant to be a manifesto for the rebellion. And in that case, the verses in the beginning were stitched together by somebody later to connect in sequence Genesis and Exodus. So that's one possibility. Another possibility, as I was hinting at, is between the Deuteronomistic history, which is the entire stretch from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, from Moses standing at the edge of the Jordan, leading people into the land till they're out of the land in exile. And we're going to see a number of close connections there. But the chicken and egg question I note here is which came first? Is 1 Samuel before 2 Samuel? Are they from the same time period? Are they from the same time period as any one of these things? In other words, if there are links between the Jacob story and the 1st and 2nd Samuel story, who's listening to whom? One of them has to be first, unless they're writing simultaneously in exile, which is possible, but that would be hard to determine. Finally, on the relation to other parts of the Bible or prophetic texts like Hosea 12, I won't look at it now, but there's a number of elements there, including talking about Jacob and Esau as brothers. So we're going to have to look at that ostensibly in 8th century text. If our story in Genesis was written in the 6th or 5th century, how does Hosea know about that in the 8th century? So that's something we'll have to look at. There are also several reading levels, and this will overlap with what we'll see next in the question of times of reading. And this is just a matter of inside the text. What are we focusing on? So there's the immediate story of Isaac and Rebekah's children, Jacob and Esau, and just the family stories here. And I shouldn't say just, like that's minimal. These are the ancestors, and Jacob's going to become literally Mr. Israel himself. But at one level, we just read about their stories. At another level, we pay attention to the two nations signal that we just saw in verse 23 on the left side of the screen, and read this as these are ciphers for the nations. Jacob as Israel and Esau as Edom, etc. So that's another level. These are national stories being represented by these individuals. Another is to read it intertextually, as it was written to engage with other parts of the Bible, such as the monarchy story, and hence my note up here about religion of creation and religion of empire, a rubric I use in my book, Come Out My People, and I've used a number of times in these videos, to separate out in the Hebrew Bible the parts of it that are like Genesis, focused on inclusivity and God as creator, and humans meant to be focused on the land, land versus the religion of empire, where there's a hierarchy and exclusion of people who are not us, and people are focused on living in cities, among other things. And so there's some question there of whether Genesis is meant to be a counter story to the monarchy story, as well as we saw in the primeval history, a counter story to such Babylonian stories as the Enuma Elish. And then there's the question of ethics and morality. And really, even to raise that question is to suggest something that many scholars take for granted, which is that it's our job as interpreters to judge Jacob's behavior, to decide whether what he's doing is good or bad, but based on what criteria? Based on our own personal theology, as a Jew, as a Christian, as a secular humanist reading the Bible, based on internal evidence in Genesis that Jacob doesn't know about, but we as readers know about, based on the Torah, the laws in Exodus or Leviticus, but Jacob doesn't know about those either. Are we as readers supposed to know about them? Are we expected to apply those to Jacob even though he doesn't know about them? That doesn't seem fair, does it? How about based on the prophets, people like Hosea and other prophets who may well be from the 8th century before Genesis was written? But again, we don't expect the characters to know that, so they can't be shaped by the voices of people like Hosea, who were writing long after at least the ostensible time where the characters existed. And then do we judge by today's Western standards of individualism and feminism and other things that would lead the patriarchal elements to be seen as immoral in a way that the original audience may well have not? So a number of those things we'll have to pay attention to. And I want to be able to check my own assumptions as we go, that I'm not just evaluating the characters based on my personal views. Why should you care about my personal views? I don't care about your personal views because I don't even know who you are. But even though you know who I am at one level, this isn't about what Wes Howard Brooks thinks. It's about what we can determine the text is about and what the original authors were trying to convey. So here at the bottom of this chart are the mentions of Jacob outside Genesis in the Bible. And notice 170 times, including in the New Testament, and 19 are in the phrase Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Hebrew Bible, and 69 have Jacob as equivalent to Israel, especially in the prophets and Psalms, where there's a poetic parallel. Jacob is like this and Israel is like this, speaking of the same thing. So very few are actually about a character, a human being named Jacob, as opposed to a symbol of the three-part patriarchal ancestry or as the national symbol of Israel. So there's not a lot of Jacob's story, apart from Hosea, outside the book of Genesis, and that's something we're going to have to pay attention to too. Okay, so moving on, let's pair that with times of reading. And we won't go over this in great detail, but the one we can't obviously get back to is the story time, when the narrated events purportedly took place in the land of Canaan, in the cultural clash between the first followers of Yahweh and the local Canaanites and Mesopotamians, when he ends up with Laban. And presumably the method is oral storytelling, because this is before the time of writing and before people had cultural context to produce paper and scribes, etc. So this is an assumption that some scholars share and some don't, that this story begins with an oral tradition. But many don't believe that. They believe it was exclusively a written story, and this is suggesting, with a question mark, from the time periods I was just suggesting, this representing exile or post-exile, and the context that I was just suggesting. I don't need to go over that again. And the presumed reading method here is this is historical revelation in the time of Moses, which is to say people reading it in that time period may well have assumed that, even though the elite would have known that they wrote it, but out into the ordinary world it's presented as if it's from the time of Moses. And that was certainly believed until the advent of modern historical criticism in the 18th and 19th century. There's the time of the translation from Hebrew to Greek in what we know as the Septuagint in Alexandria and Egypt, in the social context of the challenge of Greek culture, for example, philosophy, to diaspora Jews. And that continues to be a challenge all the way up until the invention of Christianity in the 1st and 2nd century CE. And so the presumed reading methods there is going to be a combination of history and allegory borrowing tools from Greek philosophy as a way of reading text. Next is New Testament time. So how is this read by people considering the Jesus event in Palestine and the various Greco-Roman cities around the Mediterranean, where, for example, Saul, also known as Paul, brought the message of Jesus. And now we reach the place where we have a clash between Jews and Romans on the other hand, and the challenge of the Jesus movement on the other over the meaning of Scripture. And in that context, Jews often refer to the Romans under the rubric of Esau, interestingly, taking that from within their standpoint. Christians, or at least Jesus followers at this point, might see it a little differently. Then there's in Roman times, and this time period represents the advent of imperial Christianity after Constantine and then the time of Theodosius, when Christianity became the state religion of the Roman world, and the Jews began to write down their own commentary known as the Midrash. And the places with a question mark because it could be anywhere around the Mediterranean. And here the social context is the adoption of the Hebrew Bible by the Romans as part of the imperial religion amidst oppression by Jews by Christians. And the reading method there, this is by Jews, is Midrash, the playful but serious commentary that we've been looking at throughout the reading of Genesis. And then finally, our time, when we as readers encounter the ancient stories wherever we are. And the social situation, as we know, presents us with the challenges of conflicting worldviews, of scientific, global economic, and fundamentalist worldviews on Jews and Christians, whether you're a fundamentalist or not. And I certainly know, as someone who taught undergrads and has, a grandchild who's about to become an undergrad, that many people have been turned off to the Bible precisely because of the fundamentalist worldviews and wouldn't even be bothering to listen to a video like this to find out alternatives, because that's been so powerful in turning people off who come with a mind open to learn new things. And here the reasoning methods presumed I'm following to follow the pattern, but it's not presumed. There we can know the choices, and there's a whole wide range of them that we've been looking at throughout this series. So with the places and the issues in mind, let's just look at a couple more things before we finish this and launch the next video into our story. So we're going to look at how the story is shaped three ways. First, there's this simple tripart division. Jacob and Esau in the beginning, and the question of the birthright and the blessing. And I can note right now the wordplay there between Bakora and Barakah, where the consonants are just reversed there, around Jacob getting both of those from Esau. And that leads Jacob to be sent by his mother Rebekah and his father Isaac back to the old country, to Paddan Aram, to Laban to find a wife. And he'll find two wives there, and we'll see the sequence of that, where Jacob is with the two wives, and then we see the women with each other, rivaling over motherhood, and then the two wives with Jacob again, and then his journey back. So the journey out via Bethel and the journey back via Bethel. And then the reconciliation with Jacob and Esau that starts off in the dark and ends up in the light with a warm reconciliation. Another way to look at that is through this detailed chiasm. And this form is from Michael Fishbane from his book Biblical Text and Texture from 1998. And he shows in great detail here. And I note below, Gordon Wenham, writing a little later, has a slightly different arrangement, placing 29:31 to 30:24 as the G in the center. But in Fishbane's, there is no center. There's simply the parallel here. So I don't need to go over all of this. And this just goes through chapter 35, although chapter 36 is ultimately part of it. It's kind of a postscript in the way the first part of chapter 25 was a postscript to the Abraham story. So it's just framing it here. With the oracle sought here, and Rebekah struggling in childbirth, and then Rachel struggling in childbirth on the other side of the chiasm. The interlude here around the Barakah, the blessing, and the interlude here where Jacob tries to offer a gift, but it's the blessing, Barakah, back to his brother Esau. So he gets it for the bowl of lentils here and then offers to give it back there. Deception here for the blessing stolen in his fear of Esau, and deception planned in the fear of Esau, and the gift returned down here. Then we have the encounter with the divine at Bethel at the border site, and the flip side of it with the encounter at the border again. One with the ladder and one with the wrestling. Then the internal cycle opens between Jacob and Laban at the border here, and Jacob and Laban on the way out of town there. And then the issue of fertility, which of course is what blessing is about, and this whole story is about that God provides fertility, and Rachel starts off barren and becomes fertile, and then Jacob exploits the fertility of the sheep to outwit Laban, the trickster. So that's the shape of our whole story. And then finally, we need to look at places. And Jacob's story is about travel, as we just showed. And so I'll have all of these, of course, on the webpage at radicalbible.net, so you can see the range of places that he goes. And this is an excerpt from the map we've been looking at, so you can see it there. You can also see it here as how he interacts with the places where his grandfather Abraham was here. And of course, there's no Isaac story, so we left Isaac at Beer Lahai Roi, and Jacob is starting out at Beersheba, but he's going to end up all the way back in Paddan Aram, like the place that Abraham's father started from up at Haran. So replicating that journey in the opposite direction here. So that's just a few things about this complicated story. And if that seems like a lot, you can use this as like a table of contents in a way as a reference to go back to. And I'll be referring back to it and back to some of these charts as we go. So next time we'll begin the story of the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. See you next time for that.